Hello, this video will be a black openings tier list for intermediate players. We're going to assume that intermediate players are rated roughly between 1000 and 1650 on chess.com. The boundaries for that can be give or take a little bit. We're assuming that players that you're facing at this ELO range can reliably know roughly 5 or so moves of theory per line. We're also going to assume that they can reliably know the top 3 or so responses that are most commonly seen. And the other thing we're going to consider are that gambits at this ELO can still reliably work, and it's not a given that they're going to fail 100% of the time. Starting with the From's Gambit, which starts after 1 f4 and black playing the move pawn to e5. This move is not very good. It's kind of just cheesy. You're kind of hoping for a famous trap where if white takes a pawn, you play queen h4 check. If white blocks with the pawn, you're going to play bishop e7. And if they take the queen, this is checkmate. But basically, if white doesn't fall for this exact trap, white actually just gets a better position out of the opening. Against 1 f4, the best response, according to theory, is supposed to be playing d5, contesting the center. I think because of this, considering that you're only really playing for one trap, and if they don't fall for it, you're losing, I have to just throw the From's Gambit in trash. Next up, we have the Hippo, which is a system-based opening for black, so it's not too important what white plays. But the idea of it is that you're going to be playing the moves g6 and b6, and going for this double fianchetto setup with both bishops on long diagonals. It's considered a modern opening where you're allowing your opponent to take control of the center early, and then you want to contest the center later on in the game. The Hippo's okay. I think there's better system-based openings out there, but it's definitely a playable opening, so I'll give this bad but playable. Next up, we have the Queen's Gambit accepted, which starts after d4, d5, pawn to c4, which is the Queen's Gambit, and then accepting with d takes c4. There's a common misconception out there that the Queen's Gambit accepted is bad or losing for black, which is actually not the case. This opening is perfectly good, even at the top level. I actually think the Queen's Gambit accepted is deceptively good at this level. And the reason why is because a lot of players as white will study this line just knowing some of the traps. But if you study this line more than your opponent, I actually think black stands a lot of winning chances. So I think the QGA is actually a very deceptively good choice, especially if you're a positional player or you're a player that likes longer games and likes to grind out games with a lot of moves. So I actually think the QGA is going to be our first S-tier opening against the Queen's Gambit. Next up, we have the Queen's Gambit declined. Again, in the Queen's Gambit, d4, d5, pawn to c4. And this time we're going to decline the gambit by playing pawn to e6. The Queen's Gambit declined is also a very good opening. It's a bit easier to learn than the Queen's Gambit accepted. It's also a good option if you're more of a fighting or combative player. Some of the ideas are that you do want to eventually take this pawn, but you want to wait until after white moves their bishop one time so that you win a tempo back. So there are some strategies for black to gain an advantage in the QGD. I think the QGD is also a good S-tier opening. Funnily enough, I think both the Queen's Gambit declined and accepted are both excellent options against the Queen's Gambit. Next up, we have the Slav Defense against the Queen's Gambit, which after the Queen's Gambit, d4, d5, pawn to c4, we're going to play the move pawn to c6 in order to defend our d-pawn. This opening is a bit drawish especially at the top level, because once white eventually trades pawns, we end up with a very symmetrical pawn structure, and it's hard to fight for an advantage here, and the games end up being pretty equal. So if you're trying to climb rating online, I don't think this is a great choice, just given that it leads to dry and drawish positions. If you're in a tournament situation where you need a draw, this could be a good choice. But overall, I think I'm going to put this in bad with playable, just due to the fact that it's mainly playing for a draw. Next up, we have the Albin Countergambit, which in the Queen's Gambit after d4, d5, c4, we're going to counter Gambit by playing the move pawn to e5. This move actually has a lot of traps if white is not prepared, and can really easily lead to white just losing the game right out of the opening. I think the Albin Countergambit is really good, especially if you're a player that loves gambits and loves to attack. I'm between putting this in good and S tier. I'm going to put it atop of good. It's a very, very good gambit choice. The higher in rating you get, the less and less good this will become. But this is certainly a weapon that can take you all the way through all of the rating ranges that this tier list is designed for. Next up, we have the Nimzo-Indian, which starts after d4, black responding with the move knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight to c3, and then black playing the move bishop to b4 in order to pin the knight to the king, and making it much harder for white to ever play the move pawn to e4. This is a very positional weapon of choice. I think the main issue with this is that you need all three of these exact moves from white to happen in that precise order. Otherwise, you're not going to get the Nimzo-Indian. For example, after we play d6 or e6, if white plays knight to f3, we can no longer play the Nimzo-Indian. It would be good, or S tier even, if you get the starting position. I think the main issue is just that it's not very practical because we need three very, very specific moves to happen in order. Otherwise, we don't get the starting position. Next up, we have the Grunfeld Defense. Starts after d4, knight f6, c4, pawn to g6, knight c3, and then black playing the move d5, as opposed to the King's Indian, which would play pawn to d6 instead. And then usually after takes, this is like the exchange variation of the Grunfeld. But there's a lot of different moves that white can play. I think at this level, the Grunfeld is just too much theory. It's a really complicated opening with a lot of different lines that are viable. And if in any of those lines you don't know the theory, you can end up with just a much, much worse position. So I think the Grunfeld is just too much theory at this rating range. Next up, we have the King's Indian Defense, which can be played after any 1d4 opening. After d4, we typically play knight to f6. And then it doesn't really matter what white does. There's a lot of different moves that we can play this against. But it typically looks like this pattern with black, fianchettoed bishop, knight on f6. It's a modern opening, and we're eventually going to strike back in the center, either with pawn to e5 or c5, depending on the situation. And sometimes we even pawn storm on the king side and try to checkmate white. It's a very flexible opening with a lot of dynamic play. I think the King's Indian Defense at this rating range is still one of the best opening options out there, and beyond. The King's Indian is a fantastic opening. You can play it against anything 1d4. So it covers pretty much any bases you have to worry about in that. And if you learn it well, you're going to know it better than most of your opponents, because the King's Indian is almost never the most popular response in any line. So I think the King's Indian Defense is an easy top of S tier choice opening. Next up, we have the Queen's Indian Defense, which starts after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, and instead of the Nimzo-Indian with bishop e4, we're going to play pawn to b6, eventually putting our bishop on b7 to fianchetto, and then we're going to strike back in the center later with d5 at some point. The Queen's Indian Defense is a good opening. I think it's quite a bit worse than the King's Indian. It's not as flexible, and it's a bit harder to learn without presenting as much upside, I think. I think it's just an all-around worse King's Indian, in my opinion. So I'll put it in good, because it's still a good opening choice, but I just think the King's Indian is better all around. Next up, we have the Dutch Defense, which after 1d4, we're going to play pawn to f5. And then our game plan is going to be, usually we're going to fianchetto, put our knight on f6, and then castle, where our rook is going to have a potentially open f-file to work with. The Dutch Defense is also really good because, again, we always are going to get it against 1d4. And it's also pretty uncommon from White's perspective to see it. So if you study this a lot, you're going to be much better prepared than many of your opponents playing 1d4. Once again, I think the Dutch Defense is another really good opening choice at this rating range, especially if you're a player that likes to attack. I'm going to put the Dutch Defense in S tier as well. Even better than the Queen's Gambits, because unlike the Queen's Gambits, you're not going to get those 100% of the time, because sometimes your opponent's going to play the London instead. But if you're playing the Dutch, you're always going to get the Dutch. So it's just you're going to get this more consistently, and you're going to know it better than your opponents. So I think it's an easy S tier. Next up, we have the Budapest Gambit with d4, knight f6, c4, and then pawn to e5. One of the traps being that the move pawn to d5 is actually bad for white, because we can very simply just play bishop to c5, and this bishop is going to be a god for the entirety of the game. But if white correctly takes a pawn and then defends correctly, white's just doing better. I think at this rating range, the way it's going to work is players are going to face the Budapest one time, and then they're going to learn how to counter it, and then they're never going to lose the Budapest Gambit again. So it's really just kind of there to trick someone one time, but it's not really an opening that you should be maining if you want to climb seriously. I'm going to have to throw this in trash. Next up, we have the Englund Gambit, which begins after 1d4 and black gambiting with the move pawn to e5. Unfortunately, at this rating range, the Englund Gambit just doesn't work. According to the stats, like, white just knows how to counter it way more than a majority of the time. So very simply, this is just another trash opening that is just hoping to play for tricks, but usually doesn't work. Next up, we have the Knights Tango. I think I've sometimes called the Mexican Defense. After d4, knight f6, c4, and knight to c6. The reason it's called the Knights Tango is because a lot of the times you're going to attack the knight as white, and then the knights are just going to dance all around the board. But this opening is not bad. It's also not great. It doesn't really have many tricks. All you're really hoping for is that white gets way too greedy trying to attack this knight to the point where they just completely forget about development. But if white ignores your knight and just develops as normal, they're doing completely fine. I think because of all of that, I'll put this in bad but playable. It doesn't really have a lot of upside, but it's also not like losing in any way. Next up is the Polish defense, which begins after d4 and black playing the move pawn to b5. This opening is pretty simply just trash. You're just giving up the center. There's not really any tricks. It's just not a good opening in any way. Next up is the rat defense, which begins after d4, d6, c4, e5, known as the rat defense. Like the Knights Tango, this opening is fine if you get the starting position. That is one issue with it, is you might not get the starting position. They could just play e4 instead, and now you're in a Pirc instead of a rat. So the rat is just not great. It's not great, it's not bad. So I'll put it in bad but playable. It's kind of just like the Knights Tango to me. Next up we have the Benoni Defense, which usually begins after d4, knight f6, c4, and then c5. White usually ends up playing pawn to d5, and we end up with a very closed and cramped position as black. This opening, it's kind of hard to rate. It's not bad on paper, but the position itself is really difficult to play. Like, this pawn causes a lot of issues for us as black, and it's not really easy to play this position for many people. You have to be really patient and really slow, which is kind of hard for players at this rating range. If you know all your theory and you study this opening, like this is a good or S tier opening, but just because of the style of it, I kind of want to put it in bad but playable. I'll put it at bottom of good. It's a decent opening, but the positions it gives you can be really difficult to play if you don't like cramped positions where you have little space. The Benoni defense is not good for you then. Next up is the Benko Gambit. After d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, and then we play the move pawn to b5 in order to gambit the pawn. I think if you get the starting position for this, the Benko Gambit is really, really, really good at this rating range. I think if you get the starting position, this could be S tier. That's my issue with this, is that it may not be super consistent, that you get the starting position all the time. I'm going to put this in top of good tier because of that. It's a great opening, just a little inconsistent to get the starting position. Okay, next up we have the group of the Sicilian dragon variations, which begins in the Sicilian defense with 1 e4 and then pawn to c5. And then the different variations of the dragon just depend on when we play the move pawn to g6, if it's before or after we push our d-pawn. So the hyper-accelerated dragon would be pushing the g6 pawn on move 2. I think the normal dragon would be after we play d6, and then we play... if we play d6 and then push our g-pawn, that would be the accelerated dragon. And then if we move our knight out and then play g6, this is the normal dragon Sicilian. I think all of these are very good options. These are some of the few Sicilians that I would recommend at this rating range. And if you are someone who's interested in learning the Sicilian, I think one of these dragon variations is a great entryway into getting started playing the Sicilian for black. They're all very close in rating to me. I think the dragon variation's the least good, but it's still good. I think the hyper accelerated is a little bit better than the normal dragon. And I think the accelerated dragon is the best one. I think it might just squeeze into S tier. Yeah, I think the accelerated is just good enough to be a little bit like a tier above these two. But all three of these dragon Sicilians are great options if you want to get started playing the Sicilian. Next up we have the Najdorf Sicilian, which is actually the Sicilian variation that I personally main. E4, C5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and then pawn to a6 is the starting variation of the Najdorf Sicilian. And from here, I'm not even exaggerating, there's like 10 different moves from white that are all considered mainline variations. Bishop e2, bishop e3, bishop e3, f3, h3, h4, a3, a4, rook b1, rook g1, knight b3, and knight f3. All of these arrows that I've drawn, I'm not even kidding, are all legitimately dangerous main lines from white. So at this rating range, the Najdorf is just way too much theory. I'd be happy to make videos for each one of those variations, but for most people at this rating range, I think this is too much theory for them to have to try and learn. Next is the classical variation of the Sicilian, which begins in the Sicilian after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight f6, knight c3, and then knight to c6. This is the starting position of the classical open Sicilian. At this rating range, I think this version of the Sicilian is a little bit too difficult to play without presenting a lot of upside. Not only that, a lot of players as white are going to know how to play against this because this is one of the most common ways that black plays. I'm going to put this in bad but playable, just given the reasons that it's a little hard to learn and white's going to know how to play against it a lot of the time. Next up is the Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian. Forgive my pronunciation. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight f6, and then knight to c3. The difference between this and the classical Sicilian is that we haven't played pawn to d6 yet. So we have a lot more flexibility in terms of where we move our pawns. On paper, this opening is better than the Sicilian classical, but I think it's just even harder to learn at this rating range. So I'll put it just underneath the classical Sicilian. Next up, we have the Kalashnikov variation of the Sicilian, which in the Sicilian, e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn. We're going to play pawn to e5, immediately attacking this knight on d4. And then typically we're going to play pawn to d6 afterwards. This opening is rather dubious at this rating range and above. Almost every single other version of the Sicilian is notably better than this one. This one's quite a bit cheesy in a way. I'm going to put this one in trash. It's just not very good. Next up, we have the Scheveningen variation of the Sicilian, which begins in the Sicilian Defense after knight f3, d6, d4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight f6, knight c3, and then pawn to e6, taking a small center. This opening is pretty underrated at this rating range. It's severely fallen off in popularity at the top level, mainly because of what's known as the carries attack with pawn to g4. This opening is a very, very scary opening at the top level, but it's pretty uncommon at this rating range. I think this opening's okay. It's pretty underrated. So I'll put it in good tier. Just consider that the other like dragon variations are going to scale better as you climb into higher rating ranges than the Scheveningen will. Next up is the Taimanov variation of the Sicilian, which in the Sicilian, again, we're going to go into the open Sicilian with knight f3. Black plays pawn to e6, and then after opening it up, Black usually plays knight to c6, which is a starting position of the Taimanov variation. At this rating range, this opening choice in the Sicilian is very middle of the road. Like, it's not great, it's not bad. It's perfectly mid. I'll put this one towards the bottom of good tier. There's just nothing really about it that stands out, either in the good or the bad way. It's fine. Next up is the four knights variation of the Sicilian. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, pawn takes, knight f6, and then knight c3. Distinguished by all four of the knights being developed. This one to me is very similar to the Taimanov, in that it's just very mid. Nothing stands out for it in the good or the bad way. That's really all I have to say about it. Next up is the Kann variation of the Sicilian. After the Sicilian, e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, pawn takes, knight takes, and then I believe just a6. Yeah, a6, and then it's the starting position of the Kann variation. It's similar to the Najdorf, the difference being that we put our pawn on e6 instead of a pawn on d6. At this rating range, it's a lot like the Najdorf. I think it's just a little too much theory at this range. Next up, we have the pin variation of the Sicilian, which begins in the Sicilian defense. We're looking at the open Sicilian with knight f3 and pawn to d4. And then the pin variation is denoted by playing bishop to b4 in order to pin the knight to the king. This opening is very dubious. If white knows what they're doing, they're literally just winning or better. They have to play e5, and then after their knight moves away, white just plays queen to g4, attacking the g-pawn and the knight. And then black is just known to be losing here with best play. But if white doesn't know what they're doing, this pin could be very useful. So it's pretty high risk, semi-reasonable reward, not super high reward. I'll put this at the top of bad but playable. Again, it's very risky. And if white knows what they're doing, again, white is just better. So not really worth playing this. I'm actually going to put this lower just because of that fact. Next up, we have the O'Kelly variation of the Sicilian. In the Sicilian, e4, c5, knight f3, and then I think black just plays the move a6 right away, which can sometimes transpose into other openings like the Najdorf or the Taimanov or other openings. I think at this rating range, kind of like the Najdorf and the Kann, this is just too much theory at this range. You're just getting a little bit too fancy for no reason. by playing this move order. Next up, we have the Nimzowitch variation of the Sicilian, which in the Sicilian e4 c5, knight f3, we play the move knight f6 right away. This opening's kind of dubious because you're walking into pawn to e5, attacking your knight right away, which if you don't know what you're doing, this could be potentially very, very dangerous for black. I think this opening it's not bad, but it takes way too much theory for what you get out of it at this range. At higher ranges, there is value to it because you can trick people with weird move orders and such, but for this rating range, there's not really reason to play this over almost any other Sicilian option. I'll put this top of the trash tier. Next up, we have the modern defense, denoted by after white plays e4, we play the move pawn to g6. The modern defense, it's fine. It's system-based, so you can kind of play it against any opening. Hard for me to rate it. If you want like a low maintenance repertoire, this has some value. It's just not very strong on paper. It's kind of like the London system in my head, or how I think about it. Like it's somewhat passive and not very immediately combative, but that's really the trade-off of it. I'll put it at top of bad but playable. Next up is the Owen's defense, which after e4, black typically plays pawn to b6, and then we're going to fianchetto our bishop, and play in a very modern style opening once again, where we give up the center and then try to fight for it later. Owen's defense is actually a little bit better than the modern. To me, I think it's enough where I'll put it at the bottom of the good tier. It's still just not too great, but it's a fine opening. Next up, we have Alekhine's defense, which after 1e4, black plays a move knight to f6, which is a modern opening because if white wants to, they can push their pawn to e5, attacking the knight, and they can just end up with a really big center early on if they want to. And like this is considered the main line starting position of the Alekhine defense, where white just gets this monster center right away, and then black is hoping that it's going to crumble down later on in the game. This opening's okay. If you really know what you're doing with black, it has some value. But on paper, it's not super good. So it depends on the type of player you are. For me personally, I don't really like this kind of opening. I'll put it at the top of bad but playable. But depending on your style, like if you really, really want to study the offbeat, not common opening like this, there is value to that for sure, especially at this rating range. Next up, we have the Scandinavian Defense, which after 1e4, we play pawn to d5. Usually white takes, and then after the knight goes to c3, black usually puts their queen on one of these three squares. The Scandinavian Defense is a decent opening. It's not as good as it was in the beginner tier, where I put it at S tier for how easy it is to learn. I think at this rating range, players as white are just going to be a lot more prepared against the Scandinavian because it becomes pretty common. I'll throw this in the middle of good. It's still a decent, good opening choice that can easily take you to like 2000 and beyond if you want to. I just personally think there's better choices against e4 if you want to be more ambitious. Next up, we have the modern Scandinavian. Like the Scandinavian, after white takes, instead of immediately retaking with our queen, we play knight to f6 to try to recapture with our knight instead. It's hard for me to rate this compared. I think it's pretty much exactly the same to me in terms of rating as the normal Scandinavian. You can play either one of these, and they're both pretty equally good. I don't really think one stands out to the other one in any sort of way. Next up, we have the Pirc Defense. Typically, after black or white plays 1e4, black plays pawn to d6, and then we're going to fianchetto our bishop, castle kingside, and pretty much give up the center and play in another modern approach. The Pirc defense is not great, and if white knows what they're doing, it's pretty easy to beat the Pirc defense with white, in my opinion. You can check out my video on the f3 system against the Pirc if you want an easy way to destroy the Pirc defense. I'm going to put it at top of bad but playable. Not everyone is super prepared against the Pirc defense, so you can get playable positions. But against players that are very well prepared, this is pretty risky to play for not much upside. Next up, we have the French defense. After white plays e4, we play pawn to e6. White typically plays d4, and we're going to counterstrike in the center with pawn to d5. The starting variation or starting position of the French defense. The French defense is a very, very good opening choice at this rating range. If you're facing 1e4 and you play the French defense, you're always going to get French defense positions 100% of the time. And if you study the French defense well, you're going to know the positions better than your opponent. I'll put this very, very high up in S tier. I think this is a really, really good choice against e4 at this rating range. Next up, we have the Caro-Kann defense, which is kind of similar to the French defense, but instead of playing e6, we're going to play c6 and then counterstrike in the center. Like the French defense, this is also an excellent choice at this rating range. I think it's slightly better than the French as well. If you play the Caro-Kann against 1e4, you're getting the Caro-Kann 100% of the time, and you're going to know the Caro-Kann better than your opponent will. I think the Caro-Kann is one of the best choices against 1e4 at this rating range. Next up, we have e5, which very simply begins after e4 and then e5. This is a really, really flexible opening choice. If you want to play gambits, there's a lot of gambit lines available, like the Stafford. If you want to play solid, you can just play traditional e5 stuff. There's all kinds of ways you can play e5. It's just such a dynamic and flexible opening. There's no way I can put this anywhere underneath S tier. I think just given how flexible e5 is in terms of play styles, I have to put this really high up in S tier because literally any kind of player can find an opening in e5 that they're gonna like. There's so many good choices in e5 in terms of openings against anything that you can see as white. So there's a lot of depth to learning e5. And if you're able to find openings that fit your style in e5, I think this is a great choice. Next up, we have the Petrov's defense, which begins after e4, e5, knight f3, and then black plays knight to f6, inviting white to capture the pawn on e5. The Petrov defense is fine. If white knows what they're doing, it just leads to kind of drawish positions. If white doesn't know what they're doing, you could trick them. There are some traps in the line. I'll put this at the bottom of good tier. It's okay. Next up is the Philidor defense, which after e4, e5, knight f3, we play the move pawn to d6 in order to defend our e-pawn. This is a pretty passive opening, and it's not very good. if white knows the critical move pawn to d4, white's almost guaranteed to just end up with a better position, where black just has pretty much zero counterplay. If you're curious, the move pawn to d6 is way, way, way worse than knight to c6 to defend the pawn. I think for all those reasons, I'm gonna throw the Philidor in the trash tier. It's just a passive opening with no upside to it, so it's just not very good. Next up, we have the Damiano Defense, which after e4, e5, knight f3, we try to defend the pawn with pawn to f6. Unfortunately, if white has seen this before, this move is just completely losing, because white can just capture our pawn on e5 anyways. And if we try to capture back, they're going to play queen to h5, and black is already losing out of the opening. So pawn to f6 is literally just losing on move 2. So if I have to rate a move that just loses the game on move 2, I'm going to throw this at the bottom of the trash tier. Next, we have the Stafford Gambit, which begins in the Petrov defense after e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes pawn, knight c6, knight takes knight, and then d takes c6. This is the starting position of the Stafford Gambit. I think if you get the starting position for this, it's pretty decent. There's a ton of traps, and if white doesn't know what they're doing, you're almost guaranteed to win just because of how many landmines and traps there are. Unfortunately, getting the starting position is a huge challenge in itself. I'm considering throwing this in not practical, mainly just because of how hard it is to get the starting position. If you get the starting position, I would put this in good tier at this rating range, but just because of how unpractical it is, I'll put it in not practical. Next, we have the Latvian Gambit, which starts after e4, e5, knight f3, and then we play the move pawn to f5. This line has a ton of traps and tricks in it, and it performs surprisingly well at this rating range. If you study it, you can trap a lot of players with this. I'll put this at the bottom of good tier. Next, we have the Elephant Gambit, which starts after e4, e5, knight f3, and then the move pawn to d5. When I check the Lichess stats for how this opening performs at this rating range, it's basically just a dead even split, like 50-50 win-loss draw for both sides. I think because of that, like, it doesn't stand out as good, it doesn't stand out as bad. But usually when you're playing a gambit, you're hoping that the tricky upside to it outweighs it. I'll put this in bad but playable for this rating range, just given the stats. Next up, we have the Black Lion Defense, which is a system-based opening. After e4, we typically play d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight b to d7, knight f3, and then e5. And then our plan is that we want to pawn storm our kingside pawns, and we don't want to castle at all. It's a very aggressive opening, pretty underrated and not very well known. I think at this rating range, this is a very underrated opening. I'll put this right in the middle of the good tier. I think there's some good upside to it, especially for players that aren't super prepared against it. Next up, we have the Rosseau Gambit, which starts after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, which is the Italian, and then we play pawn to f4, which is the Rosseau Gambit. Now, I looked at the stats for this opening. This opening kills it for black at this rating range. Black is winning like almost 60% of the time, meaning that white really, at this rating range, has no idea what they're doing a majority of the time. So this opening choice could be seriously, seriously dangerous given how common the Italian is and how well this performs against players at this rating range. I'm going to throw the Rosseau Gambit way up at the top of good tier. The only thing that's stopping me from putting it in S tier is that you're not going to get it as consistently as E5 or the King's Indian or some of these other openings. But if you get the starting position, like, you're going to kill a lot of players with this. Next up, we have the Schliemann Defense, which looks a lot like the Rosseau Gambit, but instead of playing it against the Italian, it's played against the Rye Lopez after bishop b5, and then pawn to f5. I checked the stats, and while it does perform well for black, it's not as good as the Rosseau Gambit. So I'll throw this in the middle of good tier. Like, it still performs very well for black at like 53% win rate. It's just not as crazy as the Rosseau Gambit's win rate. And finally, we have the Berlin Defense, which after the Rye Lopez with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, we play the move knight to f6. I'll be quick with this one. This opening is just way too much theory at this rating range. It's one of the most common openings at the Grandmaster level, but the Rye Lopez is not very common at this range, and the Berlin is really, really hard to play. And there's like a ton of lines you have to know if you want to be prepared, so it's just too much theory. And that's it for my tier list. Let me know if you disagree with any of my opinions, or if you'd like me to rank any openings that weren't featured on this list. Other than that, good luck in your future chess games, have a good rest of your day, and goodbye.